Hello, I'm Chuck Aikens, your host for Deciphering Digital. And in today's episode, we're going to be diving in how to leverage comedy in sales and marketing. I'm welcoming you to the show Jay Mays, who I met back in 2016 when he came into Volume 9, the digital marketing agency that I owned, and helped us as a consultant with our sales team in the efforts we were making in selling our services. It was through this engagement that I got to know Jay and also learn more about Pitch Lab in the workshops that he was running to help people make better presentations and use comedy and comedic techniques to improve their storytelling, their presentation, how they did in their sales and marketing roles. So with that as a background, I want to dive in to how you can craft your story using and leveraging comedy for sales and marketing with Jay Mays. Tell us about your story.
I am a recovering stand-up comedian. I did stand-up comedy for over a decade. I'm a comedy producer and a 25-year sales veteran who now does sales consulting. I think the interesting thing about my comedy career, though, is that I consider myself a failure as a stand-up comedian. What my challenge is I knew how to write a joke. I understood the mechanics of the joke. So what I decided to do was just write jokes that would get laughs. But I never worked on my authentic voice. I never worked on finding out who I was on stage. So I'd have this inauthentic persona up there. And, it turned out that, sure, I got a few laughs. I got on stage, but my career plateaued. In the meantime, I was also a salesperson. And what ended up happening is the things I was learning on stage, the confidence I was learning on stage turned out to translate to more wins in my sales job. So as I look back on my comedy career, I see it clearly now, but in a lot of ways, I was afraid to bomb. So I had this inauthentic persona. I'd get up there with fake jokes, but it's really the authenticity on stage that makes you love a comedian. And I think it's the authenticity in a sales role. It's the authenticity with your clients and prospects that helps you be successful in the world of sales. So my company now, Pitch Lab, we explore the intersection between sales and comedy, what great comedians do and what great salespeople do. And here we are.
Well, I definitely want to dive into this intersection more. For you, what is comedy? I mean, I've even heard you say before, like comedy and humor are two different things. Like, what is comedy to you? What when you say it intersects, I need a little background just to understand what intersects. So talk to us about what comedy is.
That's a good question. I don't know if anybody's ever asked me what is comedy. I would say to me, comedy is the art of making people laugh, whether it's improvisation comedy, whether it's stand-up comedy, whether it's sketch comedy. People want to laugh, so they search out comedy. When I think of humor, I think of not only things that are funny, but things that are fun, things that make you smile. Humor, to me, is a little bit more dialed back a version. And the things we've talked about in the past, what I mean when I talk about techniques that comedians use on stage to help you be, a more confident salesperson, differentiate from the competition, win more deals, whatever that is, I'm not necessarily teaching salespeople how to be funny. Right? I think what we were talking about is teaching someone to be funny and teaching someone the techniques that comedians use on stage to be more confident and engaging. Those are two different things. And, just in today's world, number one, comedy's super subjective to me. And I think what I might find funny, you might not find funny, and someone else might not find funny. So I think that's a real tough thing. And then the second thing is, there's a lot of comedy can be a very delicate situation. And what you might think is funny might not come across as funny. So I think, the type of work I do, I want to stay away from, hey, I'm going to teach folks how to be funny. I think that's a real dangerous place to be.
No, that's a great delineation, because like when I hear, you or Pitch Lab, you're going to intersect comedy and sales, I think I'm going to go in slinging jokes. You're giving me some one-liners, and you're going to somehow make my boring personality, be the life of the party, and that's not what you're talking about. So, or it doesn't sound like. So okay, so if I'm thinking about these different techniques, and just so everybody knows, like I've worked with Jay before. Gosh, how many years ago was it, Jay, that we started working together? It's got to be 7, 8,
Six now.
6
Yeah,
now.
6 or 7. Okay.
I always overestimate. I don't know if that's a comedian, how would you say it, a comedy technique or not. But so I've seen you not only do these things, but you've taught me a few items, and we'll go into that in just a little bit. But or maybe you tell me, if I were thinking about sales and or marketing, what 2 or 3 items? I mean, what would you want to teach first? What are a few of the techniques that you might say, hey Chuck, here's a technique or two we could talk about.
Yeah. I'll give you a handful. The first thing, and then I'll start with sales, and we can definitely segue it and apply it to marketing. But in the world of sales, the first thing I think about is when you want to be more like a comedian, you want to be authentic. And what that means is speak from the heart. So a lot of junior salespeople and a lot of, I would say, less engaging presenters, they have a tendency to memorize their pitch word for word, or memorize a script word for word. When you memorize like that, you're killing that connection, that ability to connect authentically. It would be like me talking to you right now, but like trying to memorize everything I want to say. I'm going to come across totally different. So speak from the heart instead of memorizing a script. The other thing the great comedians and great salespeople do is they prepare less content than time allotted. And when you do that, you're leaving room for improvisation. You're leaving room for that authentic connection. I see salespeople all the time. They get, let's say they get 30 minutes with their dream client. They're so excited to tell them so many things that they pack 45 minutes worth of slides and content into 30 minutes. And then there's no room to breathe. There's no room to even really have anything organic happen. I remember when I was a comedian for the first time, I got 2 minutes at the Comedy Works, but this was my big shot, right? This was my big shot. So I jammed 2 minutes and 20 seconds into a 2-minute set because I wanted to get all my jokes out there. Well, the outcome was a ridiculously rushed set where every time people laughed, I was stepping on their laughs. I was like, be quiet, people. I gotta keep going. I got more jokes for you. So, those type of things. The other thing that I talk about in my Pitch Lab workshops is how to manage pre-pitch anxiety, nervousness that we could talk about. The last couple are being fully visible. I believe that people need to be able to see you to fully trust you. And trust is important in comedy, and it's also important in sales. So if you see these comedians, when they get to even the mic stand, they take that mic out and move that mic stand away. You don't want anything blocking you. So how that translates is, I don't think salespeople should be standing behind a podium, or I believe salespeople, even if you can't be in the room, which is, the premier paramount way to meet with people, I want you to be able to meet face to face instead of the phone. I don't want you to have your laptop up, like it's a game of Battleship. I want as much visibility on me as possible. And then the last couple is, how are you delivering what you're saying? Are you getting that dramatic pause? Are you able to improvise? Things like that. So I'll stop there. I just gave you a lot.
Oh, no,
those are more of the techniques as opposed to let me.
Yeah. So man, I love those. I'm guilty myself of always packing so much content into a 45 or 60-minute meeting just to make sure I just want to go, right? I want to give you as much information as I can. And you're right. It takes away some of that ability to kind of wander through the subject matter, and let people respond and be with it. Now, of course, I don't want to show up with 15 minutes of material either and then have a bad meeting. So that's a great piece. I want to dive into 2 things there. The first thing, if you could share a little bit more information about, is because I have this. The anxiety. How do you work through the anxiety? How do you think about the the pre-show or the pre-presentation or the pre-meeting anxiety. Can you give us a thought or two on that?
Yeah, for sure. Number one, everyone gets stage fright. And if anyone ever tells you they never get stage fright, they are absolutely lying. Because I can find a situation to put that person in where the stakes are high enough where they will get stage fright. We get stage fright because we care, right? So if you don't ever get stage fright, you probably don't care about what you're doing. So I think it's totally normal. When I talk to my kids, getting ready for sports, big test, that perfect mixture is nervous and excited. You want to feel both, and that's going to give you a lot of extra energy. That's going to help you be on your toes. So one of the teachings that we do in Pitch Lab is it's not about killing the butterflies. It's about getting the butterflies to fly in formation. And what I mean by that is reframing that nervousness as excitement. So when you're feeling these things, you just remind yourself, this is not a threat. This is an opportunity. I am excited. So I have a tendency when things get really rough for me or I really care, this is a good thing. I am excited. I am excited. And it reframes and it helps you show up better. The flip side of this, Chuck, is when I'm not nervous at all, then I'm almost more concerned because I know I'm going to come off as low energy. So I think to have a little bit of that nervousness really helps you come alive on stage, as long as it's not so high that it's, there are people that have anxiety that is absolutely paralyzing. It's that mix where you want it just at the right amount.
No, great. The one other technique I want to dive into and have you comment on for a second, and it in my mind it's a little related because, right, I have all my content, I'm anxious, I'm high energy. Talk to me about the dramatic pause.
The exercise we do in Pitch Lab is a dramatic pause can change the entire meaning of what you're talking about. So if you're delivering content, to be able to pause really gives a chance for your listener to catch up. So if you've ever been accused of, do you talk too fast? Oh, I talk too fast. I talk too fast. I have to slow down. Not necessarily. You don't necessarily have to slow down. You have to pause more. Because I think people who are high energy and they seem to talk fast, they can come off as energetic, excited, passionate, and that could be a good thing. But if I'm talking and talking and talking and talking and talking, and there's no breaths in there, I'm not giving my audience a chance to catch up. So like a graphic designer uses white space, that's how you want to use dramatic pause when you're presenting. The other piece when it comes to sales, though, is we as human beings, or at least we as Americans, we get really uncomfortable with silence. But there's magic in silence. Being able to ask a question or let someone answer a question and not having to jump right in where you're almost starting to speak as they're finishing, and let that stillness sit there. That's really an uncomfortable silence for a lot of people and for a lot of salespeople. So whether you're presenting and you need to use dramatic pause to really be heard, or you're in discovery and a conversation and you have to be more comfortable in that uncomfortable silence, there's a lot of beauty in that pause and in that silence, especially in the world of sales.
Yeah, I remember one time in a sales presentation, we had went through the pitch and we got to the investment slide. We presented it, and I said, something along the lines of, how does that feel to you? Does it feel like a good investment for this outcome? And I was quiet. And then somebody on my team spoke. And I said, I took them aside afterwards and I said, listen, I know you don't know, but that's a dramatic pause. I wanted them to speak first. When we spoke first, we lost. So because they were thinking and they were formulating their answer, and he was about to have it come out of his mouth. And then we broke the silence because we got uncomfortable. Now, that may not be what you mean in the dramatic pause, but it was there. So, And after I learned about this, I remember every time I would watch let's say a comedy show on Netflix, and I not only saw the dramatic pause, but I also watched when people grabbed their water. Why would a comedian grab his water? Well, what's happening? Is he thirsty?
Great question. So two things on that. As an MC, whether I'm doing a pitch competition or a comedy show, when you pause in the right spot, you can actually elicit applause. Or when you pause in the right spot, you can actually elicit applause from the audience. So if you do it right, you can pause and the audience wants to put something in there. When you ask me about comedians, yes, they need to slow down sometimes, but two things. Number one, sometimes they truly need a drink. If you have a high stakes show, when I get nervous or when I get that stage fright, my mouth does go dry. So absolutely, that's part of it. The other piece, though, is sometimes using water is a way. So for your team or your team member, that after you said, "How does that investment estimate feel?" If you could have taught everybody, hey, if you can't keep your mouth shut, grab your water bottle and sip on it a little bit. It's a way to create, or it's a way to engineer a pause. So sometimes a comedian wants to just wet his or her whistle, and sometimes it's just a great way to slow things down and pause. The last piece, though, before we move on to the next one, is what you need to teach your team, Chuck, is there's a difference in perception between audience time and presenter time. Meaning in our minds, when we pause for 2 or 3 seconds, we're going crazy. So whatever team member that was, they felt that silence was deafening. But the audience, the actual prospect or the client you were talking to, they weren't even probably perceiving it as that long. So there's always going to be a difference in how long you feel that you've paused for and how long your audience or whoever you're talking to feels like you paused for. So it's an interesting perception, an interesting dynamic there.
That's great stuff, and I could listen to this and talk with you about this stuff forever. But there is one particular technique that I wanted to pick your brain about, because I know you've talked about it a lot. You work with folks on it, and that's telling a story, storytelling. First, what does it mean to you? And then start to unpack that for us a little bit, like storytelling. What is storytelling?
Yeah. So what I believe as a salesperson and even as a marketer, what I believe whether you're a salesperson or a marketer, is engagement is everything. And when you watch a salesperson in a pitch, or even the way she or he presents themselves in a first meeting, the person on the other end of the meeting there is thinking, what's in this for me, right? What's the value? And storytelling for me is a really, really fantastic way, not only to prime that pump of engagement, meaning how to be able to get whoever you're talking to primed up, excited, and into what you're saying. But there's a lot of power in storytelling. So, for example, Chuck, have you ever either seen a live comedy show or watched a comedy show on Netflix, laughed hysterically, went to bed, woke up the next morning, and you could barely remember a single joke?
Right. I just thought I drank too much. No, just kidding. Couldn't remember a thing. Like I went to tell someone how great it was, and I couldn't remember one joke.
Right. But you had a great time. It was funny, right? But there was no real retention. But if I asked you, Chuck, give me the basic premise of the movie Hangover, could you still, right now, after not seeing it for X number of years, could you still give me the basic premise of The Hangover?
Yeah.
Of course, because that's wrapped up in a story. So stories are engaging, they're emotional, and they work on a different part of our brain that makes them more memorable. So the two things that I believe around storytelling is, number one, you should always try to open with something engaging, whether you're doing something you're doing shit, even like what we're doing right now. If we can front load something that we're doing that's an engaging story, right? That really grabs the listener. Whether you're giving some type of presentation, whatever you're doing, the sooner you can front load a story, that's grabbing them. It's creating engagement. The second thing is, and this is universal around so many salespeople, is we're not always getting to all the decision makers, right? Sales is about getting to decision makers, but mostly it's done by committee. So what ends up happening is a salesperson is throwing out facts and figures and features and functionality and data, and you're talking to only part of the decision makers, and then they turn around to go tell the CFO why this is a good investment or whoever else. And it's like, I can't remember. But if you're able to wrap that into a story, it's almost like a Trojan horse where your main point of contact, you've given them something to hold on to, something a little bit more viral. So when you're not in the room, they're able to explain your value. They're able to simply explain, here's the type of things that your solution has done for similar clients. And that's what's sticky. That's what they're able to do to go get consensus within their organization. So I think there's a lot of power in storytelling for both sales and marketing.
No, absolutely. So let's talk about just in general first, how I would go about figuring out a story. I mean, we'll talk about how to tell it later. There's the hero's journey that I'm familiar with. There's a company out there that wrote a book called StoryBrand. I mean, those are examples, but how would I wrap my mind around even crafting a story? And what would I be thinking about?
Yeah, it's really great. But before I jump into my best practices, things like the hero's journey, and there's also, it's a Pixar technique called story spine. And somehow the story spine, what Pixar uses in movies, has made its way into business. I'm going to tell you straight up, I don't like either of them for basic business storytelling. That is really, really advanced stuff. If you're going to write $1 billion movie, go for it. Go grab the hero's journey, go grab the story spine. But if you're just getting going with storytelling, it's way too complex. And why I don't like it is when you can't fit your story exactly into that criteria, you feel like a crappy storyteller. And that's the last thing that we want. So my framework that I use is very simple: setup, conflict, resolution, moral. And early in my career, people would tell me, Jay, you got to tell more stories. Jay, you got to tell more stories. And I was like, what exactly is a story? And then after I researched and boiled it down, the number one thing that every great story needs is that conflict. And that's what most salespeople and most marketers are missing, because without conflict, it's not a story. It's just a series of events.
Okay.
First, we met the client and we did this, and then we helped them here, and then we helped them here, and now they're, making a 5x return. Great. That's not a story, right? The story has to wrap itself around some type of conflict. That's what makes a story great. Whether we're talking about The Hangover, a children's book, a 20-minute sitcom, if you break those down into its simplest structure, they all have conflict.
All right, so let's dive into that. So conflict is key. I feel like I would need to identify a conflict that exists. So, I mean, you coach sales teams, you've done sales, and let's even say this is let's do this in a B2B context.
The conflict doesn't have to be a person, right?
Okay.
The conflict could be customer churn. The conflict could be global warming. The conflict could be any number of things that their ideal customer or ideal prospect is facing that can be the key to that story, right? So conflict doesn't have to be hero and villain necessarily as personified.
All right. Well, let's use a comedic example, and let's say that this is going to be improv, because I'm putting it in the spot. And let's go with that customer churn. How might you, and again, I know you are going to, you don't have to nail it, but give us an idea to get us started. How would you craft the story around the conflict being customer churn?
Yeah. So the things I would go into is I would really, first things first, try to amp up the drama and make that as relatable as possible. That concept of customer churn. So you and I, Chuck, we work mostly in B2B, similar spaces here. But when you think about what it takes to land a client in a complex sales process, from whatever you're doing with outbound prospecting to writing the right amount of content to how many meetings that takes to get them through the stages of the sales process, you finally close them, you just onboard them, you got the team assigned to them, and hey, this client's got to stick around for at least 90 to 120 days to be profitable. Customer churn is a very, very, very frustrating thing, right? The cost of acquiring a new client is always so much more than retaining a client or upselling an existing client. So I would start there talking about, one of the clients we helped. They were too aggressive on the sales front. They had fantastic salespeople, but the customer churn was so painful because they needed to keep a client on for at least 4 months in order to be profitable. And the max they were keeping a customer around was like 6 months. So they were constantly feeling like they were on a treadmill there or in a hamster wheel. And then by talking and really building up the emotion and the conflict and the drama of that customer churn, even if you can relate partially, you're like, oh, I'm on board. Yeah, I know exactly how painful that is to be able to spend that time to sell it, to be able to get the right team. All you have to do those early months, how hard you have to work, and then not be able to hold on to those clients. Boom. We've just created an amazing amount of conflict in that story. Well, hopefully the solution that you're providing is the resolution of that story. We help this client by offering A, B, and C, and D. And then the moral of this story is this client, and this is where you want to work in outcomes and hopefully quantify the value. The moral of the story is this client went from, average retention of 4 or 5 months to 12 or 18 months. They don't have to spend as much on marketing. They can build stronger relationships with the clients. They're much more profitable. They don't run around with their hair on fire every day. They have peace of mind. So that's how I would approach that story.
Yeah, thank you for the example. One note, even as you were describing customer churn in that 3 and 4 month mark, I literally had a visceral reaction. And I remember when I was running that, how I felt when we got the 90-day cancel, after the first 3 months, because I felt like we totally failed on our not our brand promise, because we worked so hard to have long-term relationships. And that churn, it not only was bad to the P&L, it felt bad for the team and myself. And I remember that when you start telling the story. So I felt the conflict.
Yeah. And that's it, right? It's emotional. I grabbed you on a different part of your brain. And then if you were turning around to sell that to someone else, you'd be like, hey, so-and-so, you know how we hate XYZ? You're there, right? Now you're able to sell that internally because I touched you on an emotional level, as opposed to just saying our solution increases customer retention by 200%. It doesn't give you that same, like you called it, that emotional, visceral reaction.
I could see how that would apply to both sales and marketing. In marketing, yeah, I find myself often trying to identify and market to the pain points. If I can tell a good story around that, or the narrative to really make them feel, I'm starting to create the tension, and then I can, the conflict and the tension that could be reduced as, released as you, as you introduce the solution and the outcome. But let's go a step deeper, because that was B2B storytelling. And I think that, what I found in sales and marketing is that, we're not marketing to a business, we're marketing to a person. So when you're telling that story, or you're crafting a story, how does that person receiving it, like what might their pain points be? Like, what's their world look like? Because they're the ones who need to turn around and maybe be your champion. Like, like, yeah, I'm solving a problem for the business, but could the conflict actually ever be inside of or around the person you're actually directly talking to?
Yeah, you're bringing up some great points here. Just to kind of reiterate what you're saying, the first thing is when you're thinking of conflict, if you understand the pain points, that's a great place to start, right? The pain points can be the conflict. I really like that as like a hack. That's why, when times are tough or belts get tight or there's some type of, economic downturn, those companies that are vitamins as opposed to a painkiller, they go to the wayside, right? And so they have a hard time telling their stories, and they have a hard time, closing deals. The other piece is I like what you were saying there. Understanding what that moral is how you're able to segue the story to outcomes. So like you said, there's business outcomes, but there's also personal outcomes and there's emotional outcomes. So when you're marketing or telling stories to an individual, yes, you absolutely want to hit that. This is how it's going to help your business or your department make money, save money. I love that. But when you talk about personal outcomes, it could be things like, here's how we can save you time. Here's how we can help you hit your bonus. Here's all the things that our solution can do for you as a person. When you're going from the moral segueing, so that's one way to get that story more personal, is to talk about personal outcomes. And then emotional outcomes are things like, here's how we can reduce your frustration, give you peace of mind, reduce your stress, help you not have to deal with the headache of XYZ. So, even though you're hitting those business outcomes, to hit those personal and emotional outcomes in the story, and then be able to give that directly to whoever you're marketing to, I think that's another powerful way to customize that story to an individual level.
Right. No, I like it. I like it. So, go back. Let me think back through your origin story. Um, when I asked you to tell your story in the beginning, was there conflict?
Well, the conflict really is I wanted it real bad, right? I wanted to be on TV with Larry David, and I wanted to have my own half-hour Comedy Central special, but then I realized I wasn't good enough. I realized that I was never going to be who I wanted to be, or at least I couldn't be at that point. And so the resolution was, hey, even though I'm a failure as a stand-up comedian, or even though this is not going to go as far where I'm going to be able to quit my day job, look at all the things I've learned. Look at all the things I've gleaned. And so I was able to take that and become more successful in sales and even launch a business. So the setup is I wanted big things in comedy. The conflict is I wasn't good enough, for whatever reason, or the timing wasn't right, or I just couldn't get that figured out. The resolution was, but it's helped me in the world of sales. And then the moral is, hey, sometimes things are stepping stones. Sometimes things are, work out in a certain way. And look what it's uncovered for me in my life and my career, even though it wasn't the direction I wanted to go in.
I think that too often people are afraid to share a story or tell a story that doesn't fit. Let's call it the American dream. It doesn't breathe of success. Case studies have to be success stories. That's just, it has to be. We got to be all buttoned up and look our best. But I don't know if that's true, and I have a feeling that you might think the same way. And I would love for you to tell real quick a story that I heard you tell one time about, and I don't know what to title it, but tell the story of the juicers in the mall.
Yeah. So this is how I start off a lot, right? A lot of my talks and a lot of my workshops and sales sessions is there's two juicer salespeople on two different sides of the mall. They look the same, they sound the same, they're working from the exact same presentation. The juicer salesperson on this side of the mall, she absolutely nails her pitch. And then when it comes time to pour juice samples, she pours them out perfectly and hands them out. However, the juicer salesperson on this side of the mall, she also nails her pitch. But when it comes time to pour juice samples, she spills. It's embarrassing. She recovers the best she can. and then hands out the juice samples. Who do you think that day sold more juicers?
Well, logically, it would be the person that nailed both the presentation and the pour, but I have a feeling you're going to tell us otherwise.
Yeah, so this was actually a real study done by Vanessa Van Edwards. That day, it was the person who spilled. And that's obviously the lesson I want to start with. The punchline for me is when it comes to sales, when it comes to marketing, connection is greater than perfection, right? So if I told you that this was an actual study and this was true data, Chuck, why would you glean that the person who spilled sold more juicers that day?
I would venture to say that when she spilled the drinks, people probably jumped up to help her. She probably was embarrassed. They had empathy for her. They heard the pitch, but something connected with them when, that little 30 seconds or, a couple minutes went by. They probably got napkins and helped her clean it up. And then, right, they watched her pull it back together as a human and give it her best go. And maybe I'll buy one.
And we love an underdog story. We can appreciate making mistakes. You connected with her at a human level, right? So the other question I asked is, have you ever bought something you really didn't need because you had a real connection with that salesperson? It happens all the time. Now, what I would say to your credit, Chuck, is if I'm shopping around or exploring, for a brain surgeon, and this guy I'm talking to is bumbling and can't hold his hand still and can't even pour a glass of water, I probably don't want that person to be, performing brain surgery on me. But a juicer is something totally different, right? Helping with lead generation is something totally different. Helping with sale, like we want to deal with people that are more authentic, that we can connect with. That's the moral of the story. Is there a time to be perfect? Absolutely. But I think you, me, most of the people listening to this right now or watching this right now are not dealing in the world of perfection. We're just not.
No, I'm definitely not doing brain surgery on, I was going to say a daily basis, but on a basis whatsoever. So, all right. Now, Jay, this has been great. So I've heard all this, all right? I'm a marketer. I know you usually work with salespeople or, sales and marketers, and you got to think of both at the same time. If I'm listening to this, it's all really good information, but where do I start? How do I even begin to think about, let's say, becoming a better storyteller, or maybe, let's start there. How would I even start thinking about telling a better story?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing is that I tell everybody I work with all the time, there's a framework for everything. If you don't know what it is, look it up, find a framework that you can get familiar with, and then break the rules, but know the rules before you can break them. So number one, no matter what you're trying to do, find some type of a framework. Number two, it's the same thing that comedians do as what great salespeople and great marketers do, or great storytellers. What I like to say is telling a good story is easy. Telling a great story is really, really hard. So you have to find a way to practice. So when something happens to me that I think is funny, that I could potentially use in my workshops or on stage, I start small. Hey, I'm talking to a buddy. I slip it into a conversation with my wife. I, use it when I'm talking to my dad and start testing it in that way. Then I can slowly start working it into, more casual business conversations. And then finally, I'll use that thing on stage. But that's what great comedians do. That's why they're hitting mics every single night, is they keep practicing, they keep trying it over and over again, getting that feedback and adjusting, right? So you're familiar, test, learn, iterate, start small on the stories. Brevity is levity. Keep them short, keep them small, and start from there. And then, keep trying them in low stakes situation until you get confident, and then you release them in prime time. It's not an easy thing though. To be a great storyteller takes a long time. And the one last takeaway I'll give you is less is more. Most comedians, when they start with a joke, it could be 3 or 4 minutes and there's so much extemporaneous stuff. When you want a story or you want a joke to get better, it doesn't get longer. It gets shorter and shorter and shorter. That's why, when you could be real succinct with these stories, that's what makes them powerful.
All right, I love that. So pick a framework, break the rules, but pick a framework and know the rules. And then Mike Knight, I mean, repetition. Start small, and you'll find your way through it. Um, and as you get closer, you're saying it actually the story gets more succinct and shorter, even that you can get in and out of it. So I like that. Thinking back through the conversation here when we were talking about storytelling, I heard three different stories that could be worked on. So let me tell you what they are. Number one would be your story, what I often call in marketing an origin story. How did your product or service or business, how did you come to be? How are you in this place? So there's your story. The second thing I think is the B2B story, right? The customer churn story. You pick a pain point. That's not a bad spot to start. You said it's a hack, but it gets you started. And then you introduce the conflict and you tell stories around that. And then the third thing is that personal and emotional story. One that I really like to use is I like to think about whoever I'm selling to. Yeah, so I have my story, I have the B2B success story, but then the person I'm talking to, I want to make them a rock star. I want them to get the promotion. I want them to look good. I want them to, even if it's something as simple as, not as simple as buying swag for the trade show booth or the holiday party. I want them to feel like a rock star and be confident in their decision. So reduce stress and feel confident. So, okay, three story types: my story, the B2B story, the personal outcome story for the buyer, the champion. Which one would you work on first if you were talking with me? What would I, or does it matter? Talk through that. Like, how would you think about that as we wrap up?
Yeah, it's really good. Short answer is I've never really thought about that. So I want to give you credit. That's a great question. Just shooting from the hip, though, the story that comes easiest to you. I think there's a momentum to it. There's a confidence you need to have. Whatever story that you can tell, that you can confidently tell, that fits into that framework of setup, conflict, resolution, and it means something and it resonates, start with that, and then the rest will come. The other thing is I always keep a story file. Anything funny that happens or anything that I think might be a great story, I just write it down because, Chuck, we're busy people. You think, oh, I'll remember that. I'll work on that next time. You ask me the next day, what was that funny idea for a story? It is gone. So have some type of moleskin, some type of Evernote, some type of Word document that you're keeping these story ideas. But I do believe it's a muscle. I believe there's momentum to it. And I believe you start small. That being said, it just depends on where you're at.
I love the answer. I think what I heard there was just start, right? Pick one of their stories and just start small, put it through the framework and do reps and just work on that craft. Because it can be a powerful technique, and if it triggers that memory the next day for that person because you told a good story, you're winning. You've done something out there in the world to communicate with somebody and make an impression on them. So good. Thank you, Jay. I appreciate it. And let's wrap up there.
Awesome, man. Thanks for having me, Chuck.